So what drew you here today is that early identification. You know early intervention works. You know this why and how, because studies have been saying it for years. But it's not just studies that have been saying it. Our own children have been asking for this intervention. So watch this child and listen to him. It's only a 30-second clip as he advocates to us for the help that he needs.
Well, the really hard word is how to read.
Really?
And guess what?
What?
I don't know how to read. And guess what?
What?
I really don't like the one who says one who makes you read. There's letters, but it says it's in a different language.
Are you sure? I'm pretty sure it's probably English. They're trying to make you read in another language? I don't think so, sweetie. I don't think they do that.
Actually, they are.
Really?
Okay, that precious child is 5 years old. When do learning differences typically get diagnosed? Round about third grade, maybe 8 or 9 years old. And he's already discovered a theory of human psychology called cognitive dissonance, which is, I will make my reality acceptable to me. And what did he do? He said, well, I don't like the one who makes you how to read. And his cognitive dissonance was, it must be in another language. Because if it were in English, I bet I could do it. This is the first preservation of that ego. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to get there? And there were those early warning signs that we could educate ourselves in knowing how to help these children. Here's the presentation. So write this down. I'm going to give you the slides, but there's an acronym that represents everything we're going to talk about today, and it's CLAPS. If you were to identify those young children who are at risk for struggling with academic learning tasks, it would be CLAPS. Delays in coordination, language, attention, perception, and social emotional. So what we're going to do today is ride this ride with me. We're going to go through CLAPS, coordination, language, attention, perception, and social emotional. And we're going to say, okay, what does typical coordination look like? And then what does atypical coordination look like? And then what are we going to do about it? So we go typical, atypical, intervention. Let's roll. So first, what is typical development? Well, typical development typically follows what's called Montessori termed the planes of development. I don't know if you're familiar with Montessori, but I'm going to tell you right now, method that's been around for over 100 years and is an international method, and its basis is child development. It also is very good for children with learning differences. Why? Maria Montessori founded her method on children with learning differences. At the time, she was at the Orthophrenic School in Italy, a school for idiots, because at the time they couldn't go to normal school. Well, what did she do? She figured out through observation and techniques how to help these children. And within a year, these deficients or idiots were able to transition into normal school. What does that reveal to us? They probably had processing disorders like learning differences, and her methodologies worked. So one of the things she noticed about child development is we go through planes of development. There will always be an intensity to it and a consolidation period. So in 0 to 3, what's the intense change going on? Well, we acquire language. We acquire total control of our body. We acquire the ability to attend by 3 and mastery of our senses. What's the slower pace? That's the consolidation of all of that coming together. How to make our body and our words sync. How to filter out sensory stimulus so that we can focus on what we need to. And then what does it look like for a child who's at risk for a learning different? The path is not smooth. The path is uneven. Those milestones for language or coordination or attention or perception or social emotional, the CLAPS, when we're going through that intense change, it's discoordinated. It's not even. Here's what those areas look like during intense change, because in consolidation, we're weaving them together or almost amortizing them to become our IQ, our executive functioning skills, and our emotional skills. So the IQ, the executive functioning develops, and then the emotional skills develop. And if all develops, what happens around 5 or 6? We start our first standard school environment. But for children who are at risk, those squiggly lines do not lead to the consolidation pattern that's even also. So for a typical learner, how do they learn? Well, we're all learning right now through our senses. And boy, I'm trying to entertain you. I'm giving you a visual. Pay no attention to the background. Giving you a visual. I'm giving you auditory. Everything's coming at you. And you are sustaining attention to me so that your brain can then begin to interpret. What a brain interpretation is taking in your sensory information and logging it into which part of your brain is going to process that information through the motor cortex, the auditory cortex, the visual cortex. And once it's disseminated to that area of the brain, you create a perception. A perception has no language attached to it. So let me give you an example. If you sit down in a chair and the chair is uncomfortable to you, that feedback between the chair and your body produces a sensation. Your brain interprets it and it creates a perception. It doesn't know that it's hard or it doesn't know that it's rough. It's just a perception, similar to a baby touching something that's hot. It's a perception. It only concretizes or becomes a concept when you add language. Otherwise, it just remains a perception. So something that's loud or soft doesn't have a quality of loud or soft until I say, this is loud, this is soft. Or touching something and you remove your hand, that was hot. Or if it's that rough chair, this is rough, or this is hard, that surface. Imagine now the power of language. Without any words, things will always remain a perception. And then what do? We store that word in memory and we go, oh, okay, Mama said that was hot or Dad said that was hot whenever I touched it. Now I'm going to touch something else and it too is hot. And maybe everything that goes on that instrument in the house is going to be warmed or hot. We start thinking about this. We start then taking the language and factioning it into shades of hot. Shades of hot is burning, inferno, warm. All of these higher cognitive functions become then comparatives and superlatives and build our ability to process our world. And what happens with dysfunctions? Well, we have accurate sensory receptors. We know to have a learning difference. It can't be as a result of a hearing impairment or a visual impairment if we're looking at a constitutional learning difference. Can you have a learning difference if you have a visual impairment and auditory impairment? Yes, but constitutionally, no. It's not that there's a receptor issue. There is a processing issue. And the first avenue to having a processing disorder is faulty attention. Are you paying attention to the stimulus that you need to be paying attention to? Because then your brain is going to send it to where it needs to go, and there could be a dysfunction with that, which can create then an incorrect perception. Have you ever known some children who are what we would call tactily defensive? What feels smooth to me could feel rough. It could feel itchy. What seems normal volume to me could be loud. Or what seems loud is the only way that they can view it as audible, which is their regulation system or their perception of it. And then I begin to do what all adults do in a child's world. We start adding language. We start talking to babies the second they're born and even before that. And we're adding language to all of these perceptions of 0 to 3 years old, or what's called the absorbent mind, taking it all in. But if your attention's faulty, your perceptions are incorrect, me labeling it is just concretizing an incorrect perception. And then with attention off to the side, we know memory is weak then. Are we attending to what we need to? Are we going to get it into adequate memory? And then that becomes a gap in higher cognitive functions, or those things that help us process the world around you. Our language, which then leads into being able to tackle that schoolwork and listen to the teacher. So if we know birth to 3 is the intensity, with 3 to 6 being the consolidation of these areas, what would typical coordination look like? Well, typical coordination follows this chart. Right now, I could have asked you, when does a baby take their first step? And you would say, oh, about 12 months. But what if they live in England, Brazil, the Congo? Does it matter where you live, or is it a human development? It is a human development. It doesn't matter where you live. Around the age of 1 year or 12 months, you're going to take your first step. You're going to develop cephalocaudal, which is head stability to tail stability, and proximodistal. We develop core stability to then get it in our upper arms and finally in our digits. This is typical development. So what does atypical then look like when it comes to the big C, coordination? Well, we're going to start seeing what I call the cephalocaudal proximal distal. Is that body really ready to take the first step, or do we have some core strength issues? Core strength in our trunk, strength in our shoulder stability and holding our neck. I will say I can pick out the young child at 2 or 3 who looks like they're still toddling. They have that difficulty with what I'm going to call judgment of space. It feels like the fun house. That integration of the visual system and the coordination feels off. They may even nick just barely things as they walk by, because their body and space and the balance is very difficult for them. So coordination takes on 3 subset areas. Most of us know gross and fine motor, right? I'm going to introduce you into perceptual motor. Perceptual motor is where we see it the most, which is perceiving our body in space. Can we walk in a straight line? That's a coordination of the visual system and the coordination system, or the physical systems, the motor cortex. Can we tiptoe and walk on our toes? Can we grade up to hopping, skipping? All of this on a line. At first, we just want to hop, walk, tiptoe without a line, but can we do it when we narrow the space? And now if we can walk like this young child in this picture is, walking heel to toe around a maze, can we now take an object, I don't know, like a weighted cube or something of weight, and carry it? What if the object becomes something that has a spillable quality, like a cup? I hope in your mind now you're seeing the 3-year-old who's trying to walk and carry their cup to the table, and the water or the juice is spilling. This is a child who needs to go back and just practice walking in space, but have it defined by maybe a thick line or in between, like these rods. This is at a graduated level. Maybe you just put almost like out a runway, and then more narrow and narrow and narrower. Fine motor skills then are our digits. It also involves wrist rotation, forearm stability, upper arm stability, and shoulder stability. We build this way down. That's when we said proximodistal. When the core is strong, the shoulders can be strong, and so on. So what does that look like for fine motor? Those activities are enhanced by tweezing, tweezing just with our fingers. You'll see often a young child who has fine motor weaknesses and who is at risk for those greater tasks in education that require motor skills. They grasp like a young child versus using their pincer. So doing these activities to practice pincer pickup, rolling clay, Play-Doh, but make it a little bit harder. Clay is harder than Play-Doh is. Play-Doh doesn't give as much feedback. We need all of those muscles strengthened in there. Montessori has an area of the curriculum at 3 to 6 ready for that consolidation of the motor system. And it's an area called practical life where they're tweezing, they're pincer pickup, they're grasping. How in the world can we expect the zenith of what a human can do, which is acquire written language both through reading and writing if the hand is not prepared? And then gross motor. You can see a picture here of an intervention of a child just practicing controlling their motor strokes by scrubbing in a very defined space. These are kids who can be truly taught how to climb or how to lift or how to run. Oftentimes we see in education, things get taken away and a focus on academics, but the things that get taken away are core to the development of the young child. Recess gets shorter and we only get it 1 time a day versus twice. PE, maybe only once a week or every other week we'll have PE. The system that allows for all learning to take place is the development of the coordination or motor system, language, attention, perception, and social emotional. These are the building blocks. And now on to language. So what is typical language? We have receptive, which is what we understand through our auditory cortex, and then expressive, what we can say or express. Receptive involves understanding, listening, processing. Listening means attending to what the spoken word is. Oral language takes on form, the function, and the content. And then on the speech side, you can have articulation, which is a disorder of sounds or delay in articulation sounds or voice influency. I will be honest, the first sign that most parents catch of an early learning difference is language. It's not often caught with coordination because we allow for a little bit more of this stumbling to go around into 1 to 2 years, that shaky child. But when it comes to saying the first word, we are all keyed on it. Why? We have the video camera out and we're listening to every single sound they make and hoping it turns into the great debate. Is it mama or is it dada? In my case, it was daw, which was dog. Articulation of 3 sounds, a little bit harder to acquire, but the first word as he pointed and looked was dog. So typical language develops this way. At 0 to 3 months, it's crying and it's cooing. That is actually the first development of social reciprocity. If I cry, will my needs be met? Because I don't have words to say I'm hungry or I have a gas bubble or this clothing is making me uncomfortable. One of the first warning signs of a child with sensory defensive issues, they're very difficult to hold. Everything feels very defensive to them, but when you swaddle them tight, some of that crying and cooing goes away or is ameliorated. At 3 to 9 months old, babbling. Now, let me tell you what babbling is. Babbling is the first development of articulation. If I do this, oh, that's a funny sound I hear, and I'm making it with my lips doing that. Your speech musculature is your tongue, teeth, lips, nasal cavity, playing with all of that speech musculature, and you hear it and you want to make it happen again. Babbling is so important. Because next I'm going to be more intentional with it. And I'm going to echo or match tonal quality to something my ear perceived. So when my son was young, we would always go in and we would wake him up by going, hi, hi. And one time he woke up from his nap and we weren't there to greet him with hi, how dare we? And all we heard was, hi, hi. That echolalia, or we used to like to play peekaboo on the changing table. And one time I didn't play it and I heard was, ew, ew, ew. Echolalia shows me that the ear is perceiving tonal quality appropriately, and we can get it out our speech musculature. All of that leads into the piece de resistance, the first word. From birth to 5 years old, we develop our mother tongue for the grammatical quality of subject, predicate. And we start increasing our vocabulary. So by the time we enter first grade, we have between 2,500 and 5,000 words. And now we're just going to higher cognitive functions. Maybe not just subject, predicate, but adding direct objects or prepositional phrases. Not just me go here, I went to the store, past tense, doing those kinds of things. And as you can see, the typical development of oral language there, from words to phrases to sentences. Oy vey, oh my goodness, this leads to language of reasoning, the higher level concepts. But what happens to a child who has atypical language? Well, that process of babbling, cooling, echolalia, it can happen, or it could be a little delayed. The first word wasn't quite there. You will see a delay in language when they have difficulty attending to spoken language. They're not interested in listening to the story. That could either be attention problems or just not understanding what is said. They have a word order issue that's not clearing up by 2 or 3 or 4, persistent articulation errors, and then you can just go on and on. The difficulty in speech pitch, they either have unusually high pitch or low pitch whenever they speak. So what are you going to do? Direct teach. Don't take for granted that just because they're perceiving or creating a perception, that that language piece you're using is connected to their perception. Remember the chart, perception and concept. What connects them or concretizes them is the word. So often we go to the zoo and we say, okay, we're going to go to the zoo today. And at the zoo, we're going to see elephants and blah, 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 blah. And then we get to the zoo and we keep going blah, 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 blah. When I say experience, label, attribute, function, category, it means using direct, explicit language. Today, we're going to the zoo. We get the kiddo in the car, we go to the zoo. This is the zoo. I labeled it. Now, the first thing we see is maybe the big elephant. This is an elephant. Can you point to the elephant? Good. What is this? And see if they can say elephant. That's a big word, so it may come out at first, alabavahet. Great. Here's what I did. I labeled it. I checked for receptive language by saying, show me the elephant, point to it. And then expressive language. What is this? This can be done by an experience or a picture book. This expressive language introduction of label, receptive, expressive, that is straight out of the annals of speech language pathology of how they teach. All I'm saying is your first inroad is we think more talking is better. Talking that's direct and explicit. Checking for receptive language and adding in an expressive language by them. That's what building language is about. And then intervention on the receptive language side, use a slower rate of speech. Oftentimes, these students who are at risk for a learning difference have difficulty processing auditory information. So when someone is speaking, they may not perceive the pause between when one word ends and another begins. A slower rate of speech pregnates that pause and allows the central nervous system to take it in, send it to the auditory cortex for interpretation, and then over to the language side for the actual meaning of the word. I liken this to Charlie Brown's mom. Don't be wah, 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 wah. Direct, explicit, more pauses between words and sentences. And now attention. Attention, unless this is off the chain hyperactivity, goes unnoticed between 3 to 6. Let me just be clear. 0 to 3, it is sensory overload. It's called the absorbent mind because of this reason. Between birth and 3, your brain, by the human development of DNA, says you need to have as many sensory receptors to learn about your world as possible. If a baby is crawling, what do they crawl towards? They crawl to something that they see on the floor. Great, because they're seeing it. It's right there on the floor. It's at their level. What do they do with it next once they crawl to it? They put it in their mouth. Why? They're trying to engage. They grab it. They put it in their mouth. They may even stick it up their nose. From birth to 3, objects are in every hole. Why? Because we are in this huge intensity of our central nervous system trying to learn everything about what we see, hear, taste, smell, touch, and actually feel through the proprioceptive environment. But we cannot live that way. We cannot live with all of that sensory information almost attacking us. So based on DNA sequence of your genetics, between 2.5 and 3, your brain starts killing off, or we like to use the word pruning or severing and saying, we don't need all of this auditory inputs. We need just this much. And we don't need all this visual, so we're going to cut those out. We just need this much. It's called acquisition of the least noticeable difference in what we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, and feel through our proprioceptive. So that we're no longer overwhelmed. And what does that help us do? Attend to exactly what we need to pay attention to, because we don't have a surplus of sensory input or neurological flashes saying, attend to this, attend to this, attend to this, attend to this. So selective attention is developed. So from 3 to 6, we can do that consolidation, right? To get our IQ, executive functioning system, and our EQ. But atypical, they're not able to inhibit nor shut out beyond that age of 3, to wait for a turn or to not hear or perceive the sounds or movements. I oftentimes do consulting work and am asked to observe in classrooms, and specifically the ones that are the greatest teacher queries. What's going on with this child? And one of the first things I do is an anecdotal observation of just writing down what the child is doing minute by minute. And when you can be a third-party neutral and sit back, it's amazing to see how many look-arounds based on visual or auditory lack of inhibition that you can see in this child. And then the other soft sign you see is a lot of yawning, because it's exhausting to have that impingement on your central nervous system of the sound of the air conditioner, the ticking of the clock, the walking of a foot by you. It is so tiring to attend to everything that they'll go into staring, not blinking, and a lot of yawning. So here is a wonderful video that elucidates the development of self-control. This is called the Marshmallow Test. It's 3 minutes long, and every moment is of great value to you. It will at the end give some of those things. Did you know you can direct teach attention? We can help these children. So watch this video, and I always encourage you, pick out which child you would be. I know which one I am in this video.
Have you seen the Marshmallow Test? It's an experiment by Walter Mischel of Columbia University.
What we found is a very simple and direct way of measuring a competence that seems to make an important life difference.
A researcher tells these preschoolers that she's going to leave the room. If they wait for her to come back without eating the marshmallows, they'll get 2 marshmallows. Or they can ring the bell and she'll come back right away. But then they only get 1 marshmallow.
I won't ring the bell.
You won't ring the bell? Okay. Looking at children over time, Dr. Mischel has found that being able to wait longer at 4 has some pretty powerful implications.
If the kids who are able to delay gratification are increasingly learning ways of managing frustration, ways of managing distress. In middle life, there's less drug use, higher educational level attained,
When you come back out.
much less likely to have lowered self-esteem, to engage in bullying behavior with other people. Correlations are clearly statistically significant, but that in no way means that a youngster who at age 4 didn't wait a long time is in any way doomed.
There are lots of ways that you can promote the skill of focus and self-control. Here's one. It's a game that you can play with your children, and it will help them learn to wait for that second marshmallow. We call this game Simon Says Do the Opposite. When you say, Simon says touch your head, your child should do the opposite and touch her toes. And when you say, Simon says touch your toes, she should touch her head. Based on the research of Megan McClellan at the University of Oregon, this simple game is a great way to see the skill of focus and self-control in action. Head. To play it, your child needs to focus, remember the rules, act flexibly, and resist the temptation to go on automatic. The same skills it takes to wait for that second marshmallow.
That one's me.
Focus and self-control, an essential life skill.
All right, I hope you picked out your person in that. I got a chance to show this to a group of educators, and the cackles and the laughs that they gave to it were extraordinary. They all could see which one would they truly be. Okay, so some of the other activities that you can do are listed on the next slide. Practice calm, stillness, meditation. This book called Mind in the Making by Ellen Galinsky, she was speaking on that video, is incredible. Things like red light, green light, where they're given a command and they have to inhibit a response. Guessing games, puzzles, I Spy. I will say this, I think fishing is one of the greatest things that children with ADHD can learn to do. There's a reward at the end if you can learn to be patient and wait. I will say, don't go fishing for the first time when it's not a guaranteed catch. Go to one of those ponds where you can get the stimulus going of being able to catch something. And then remember, what is the actual level of attention that your child has? If their cup of attention is what I called, is about this full on a given day, but in about 5 minutes, it drains to this much, then you need to leave the activity before it becomes all the way depleted. Don't drain their cup, leave them with something. And then what are some cup fillers? Things like Legos, because they love it. It's creative. They don't have to have a very specific design. Think about what this child loves to do. As one of my great mentors, Dr. Joyce Pickering, said, every child can pay attention to something. You just need to figure out what it is. It may not be what you want, because right then it could have been Legos, or it could have been drawing, or it could have been video games. Fill that cup of attention back up so that when you do need to pull it away, they have something left to give. And now perception. We have 2 left. Let's say them already. Coordination, language, attention, and now we're on perception. Perception is your ability to use your senses to perceive accurately and in a normal or typical fashion what is being processed by your central nervous system. So accurately perceiving visual information. Is it tall? Is it short? Is it large? Is it small? Perceiving auditory information, the volume, high, low, or pitch, the volume soft and loud, pitch, high and low. It's the auditory and visual perception that actually constitutionally makes dyslexia a deficit in visual and auditory perception. Because when you see that squiggle that's a T, do you perceive it as that T? And does it match to the auditory input of T? Or does it look like an F? And you say, or an M and an N, an A or an O. Some of the soft signs are actually seen when working with a Montessori piece of equipment called the pink tower. It's all pink. Why? Because we want the color to be innocuous. It's not what you're paying attention to. But these cubes, as you can see on this slide, grade 10 cubes from large all the way to small. It was designed by Montessori in her observations that your eye perceives the least noticeable difference between each cube. If the difference, which is 1 centimeter cube, was less, some children would not perceive that difference in size gradation. If with these 10 cubes, you don't perceive the size gradation, which I can tell you right now, take it out for a 3-4-year-old who you think is at risk for a learning difference, specifically in the visual field of dyslexia. They will start with the largest. They know it ends with the small, but it gets what I call mushy in the middle. And if you've ever worked with children with dyslexia, when they read, they look at the beginning sound and they fill in the rest because internal detail gets lost. We use this piece of equipment not only as a diagnostic tool, but as a training tool. By saying, okay, if you can't perceive the least noticeable difference of 1 centimeter cubed between these 10, what if I just gave you every other one and increased the visual difference? Or just big, the one in the middle, and smaller, and then filled it in. The other perception that's faulty is in auditory, and I'll make these sounds for you. It's to perceive the difference between a, I, We always say, look at my mouth. So look at my mouth as I make those sounds. Can you really perceive the difference? My mouth is just opening a little bit and my tongue is moving forward or back. And yet, there's a least noticeable difference between those two sounds, but if you are at risk for a learning difference, you don't perceive them. So going back to echolalia, can you make the sound that you perceive at the right tonal quality and at its loud or softness? Those are some of the soft signs. So you know what I do with young children to begin? Before I attach A says ah, I will see if they can mimic my sounds and practice echolalia. La, la, la. Now you try. La, la, la. I held the last one longer. Listen to this. And now listen. Can they do it? We practice just making sounds and echoing because that is the first sense that needs to be refined auditorily in order to match sound and symbol. And then, of course, try to read. The intervention then comes. We need to define the difference and sometimes use greater differences. If I were going to teach vowels, I would go which is the U sound, and you can see a greater distance. We need to use all of our senses. So I could go using my hands to show a difference in pitch. And of course, attach language to perceptions. High, low, high, low, high, and repetition, repetition, repetition. And the last, social emotional. For some, if it's not language and it's not noticeable gross motor, we're going to see it in the social emotional. Because basic emotions like happiness, interest, surprise, fear, sadness, maybe they don't reflect on their face. Or when someone is upset, they're not noticing it. They're not picking up on those social cues. Because someone with typical social emotional uses their words to help communicate. I feel sad. That makes me sad. I'm so happy. And they communicate surprise. They develop friendships and they begin to have reciprocity and communication. They also, between 3 and 6, not only know right and wrong, they know the grades and shades. They start understanding the difference between what's right, wrong, and what would be a better choice that would lean you towards right. But for those atypical children, they have an intensity or more of what I call extremes in their emotions. They're not able to mitigate or ameliorate or lessen their emotions when they get here at the edges. Self-control is not developing. Poor reciprocity of communication. They either dominate or they don't participate. And then the nonverbal cues, not reading when they've hurt someone's feelings. So a special technique is needed. Just as I said with language, be direct, be explicit. Structure is what these children need the most. And yet sometimes I often find they're in the least structured environment. Tell me this as adults. If I said to you, we're going to a party tonight, get ready. I'll pick you up at 5. One of the first things you would think is, what do I wear? Who's going to be there? Are they going to serve dinner? Because it's 5 o'clock. You would have all of these questions because you're trying to define the structure of the event. And then you're trying to say, okay, is it like 5 to 6? Is it a come and go? Are we going to be able to leave and go out to dinner? Young children don't have experiences like you do to question. They need the structure provided. So if I said to you, at 5 o'clock, we're going to a party. And then I gave you the structure by saying, light appetizers, you can wear jeans and a sweater, and we'll leave by 6:30. How would you go into that event? Oh, much better. We take for granted young children and that they don't have schemas. So when you want them to go to, I don't know, the park, why don't you pull up some pictures of the park online, show them what it looks like, start picking out some activities that they're interested in, want to try so that when we get there, they can initiate and they can begin to play. And then thank you for joining me. I know this was a lot of information and I did deliver it quickly, but I know your time is highly valuable and I am honored that you gave it to me. Remember this, the path of development, though, no matter typical or atypical, truly is a journey. And it's a discovery that is clear only in retrospect, that it never was a straight line. Our kids, my kids that I work with, are rarely a straight line, but the joy I find in knowing that I have the opportunity to intervene and alleviate some of that worry and undue stress of not knowing or how to do certain things. That is what I take greatest pleasure in. So I hope I shared some of that with you today.
I had a question about, you did cover a couple of resources while you were presenting. Are there any other resources that you would suggest for people who want to do some further research?
There is a great series of books by the Gazelle Institute. The Gazelle Institute for Child Development, it actually created one of the first developmental tests for children on these early warning signs. And they're books that take each age and say what is typical for language, what is typical for even uh, a birthday party, what's typical discipline techniques, because my feeling is if you know what to anticipate, you can't be surprised and you're better prepared. So that idea of fortune follows the prepared mind. So look up development books by the Gazelle Institute, Gessel, and they have catchy titles like The 2-Year-Old, Terrible or Terrific, The 3-Year-Old, Friend or Foe, The 4-Year-Old, this. They go all the way up through adolescence. And then the other one is Burton L. White's Birth to 3 Years Old, about that intensity of what happens during birth to 3 and how we can facilitate the learning that's going on in that age and stage.
We talked about dyslexia as having the internal details missing. Do you have specifics on how you can work on that?
Yeah, so I would reference back anything that looks like that pink tower or something that would follow a gradation. Another activity is puzzles, not the puzzles like the 1,000-piece puzzles. If I was working with a young child who was starting to do some of those elementary puzzles, fewer shapes and seeing if they can match. They struggle greatly with things that have too much of what I call the form on the outside. They need it to be a little bit more simplistic, but yet differences. So can you picture in your mind with me the circle, square, triangle puzzle? Okay, each of those looks different. There's a great noticeable difference between that. Now find a puzzle that is gradations of triangles from large to small, gradations of circles from large to small, the stacking cups that you're stacking inside of each other. Those are things that are set to refine the visual processing system.
So we have a question about how does fetal growth restriction fit into these differences? In utero.
I can make a great assumption right now. Anytime that a pregnancy is at risk or the child after at birth doesn't follow within normal limits on either the APGAR score or some of those physical growth things, there is going to be an intercession that's going to need to happen probably with a physical therapist or an occupational therapist.
So at what age can we see that a child has poor attention?
After 3. And even in the 3-year-old, we're going to give a lot of wiggle room. What we're wanting to see is, can they go preferred, non-preferred? Because a lot of times you'll hear in this phenotype of these children, oh, they love video games, or they could watch Baby Einstein all day long, or whatever a TV show is. But can they transition to non-preferred? Usually they can't. And what they do is they give you some what I call strong feedback if they're not going to do that, or I don't want to do that. That is a lack of flexibility that is very common in children with attention weaknesses. Also, that Ellen Galinsky book, I reference it because it has so many things, activities that we know we can use to stimulate, but they're also very diagnostic too. So one of the things that she talks about is not just red light, green light, but things like the touch your nose, touch this, touch that, seeing if they can change and pay attention to the listening quality of something changing. And then last but not least, eye contact. Eye contact can have 2 causations. One is an autistic spectrum disorder, and then the other is inattention. Inattention, they have a lot of difficulty attending to eye contact, even when you're using short phrases. Good question.
So we have somebody asking when we would look at medication for ADHD.
In working with the psychiatrist that we work with oftentimes in a collegial fashion at Shelton, it depends on the grade and stage, the grading of the ADHD. If it is one of those that the motor system is so overactivated, and I'm going to term this one more of like the child is a whirling dervish, that is going to be a child who's probably going to need it a little bit faster. And we would refer to that child around the age of 4 or 5, because what's going to happen is they're not going to get any of that early schooling, because no school can constitutionally in a collective education model have a child in the room who just can't even sustain physical settledness. We leave it up to the psychiatrist. We can also see sometimes, and so I'm just going to type in somebody's, I can't find a way to start my own question on this. So I'm just going to type into somebody's, the Gazelle Development Series. But there are students who make it to 8 years old, 8, 9, and at that level, keeping up with the executive functioning skills that are required, and then also sustaining memory for learning. That memory component starts to get a little weak, that we're just not making traction. We're now into more complex things. More is being asked. I hate it, but as you get older, guess what? More is asked of you. And that's when, if it was manageable up to about 2nd or 3rd grade, we'll see that need for medication intervention. Medication is on the list by Dr. Edward Hollowell of something to try, but I want to point out there were about 4 other things prior to that. I like to say you have to dance with all of them. One is not going to be the exact precise solution. I have witnessed the magic of medication whenever it works, but it always requires some strategizing with the child to learn strategies of managing executive functioning skills. Because although medication normalizes the attention, it doesn't mean all of a sudden they're just going to know how to organize their binder or clean their room or even reading comprehension. Retain the meaning. They're now sitting at the table in order to retain the meaning, but they may not process what the main idea of something is.
Could overstimulation and atypical development develop into avoidant or defiant behaviors in the later years?
I just read an article and it talked about technology and the emotional dysfunctions that come with technology. So technology can be a high influence. And when you said overstimulation, that's the first thing I thought of is how your brain develops habits as a chemical and electrical response to a concurring stimuli. So Pavlov, when the bell dings, the dog knew to go get the treat, right? It was a chemical and electrical response. Your phone dings. What do? Immediately go check. Why don't you wait and finish listening to the person in front of you? Your iWatch buzzes, saying you have a text message. I've been sitting in meetings with families in which they're laying at my feet this idea of please accept my child to your school that specializes it, and yet they can't pay attention to me because their phone's binging. So what we have to do, there's a great book called Habits. It's a yellow cover. I wish I knew the author. Yellow cover, and it has what looks like a red hamster wheel on it. To change a habit is to introduce a different stimulus behavior and change or sever the neurological or chemical and electrical response to this stimulus and make it now respond this way. I need you to know how hard that is, so that you can recognize what to avoid introducing as stimulus response. How many of you when you are sitting on your couch watching TV, pick up your phone and surf on your phone while you're trying to watch TV too? Didn't happen 10 to 15 years ago. And why do you keep doing it unconsciously? Because of stimulus response. So yes, I absolutely agree in environmental stimulation looking like ADD and causing ADHD issues, along with emotional dysregulation.
Great. Are you aware of any developmental timelines of executive functioning skills, specifically attention, flexibility, and impulse control?
No, people don't like to give developmental timelines to that. So I have looked this up myself, and unless it's in new research as of something within the last 2 years, I wanted them to tell me that at 8 years old, you could pay attention for 8 minutes, and at 9 years old, you could pay attention at this long. That is more of a wider developmental span. Nobody's wanting to say exactly. With language and coordination, you're going to get very exact, precise. At 0 to 3, you're going to do this with your neck control, or 0 to 3, you're going to babble. But whenever it comes to acquisition of other things, for example, when do children read? Well, since it's an integration of three parts of your brain, we can't precisely say they'll read at this time because a lot of it comes by exposure, structure, their own neurological set. We can say kind of within this time. So what you're going to find is kind of within this time.
For students that didn't receive appropriate interventions in early years and are later identified with written expression, basic reading, fluency, and oral written language, in addition to the known ADHD, how would you approach supporting mitigation as a teen for those skills?
Well, it's never too late. First and foremost, it's never too late. And for someone who is housed more in the written language area, that work with a licensed dyslexia therapist needs to happen ASAP. Hopefully, if you're in a school district, it depends on the state. Some states are very progressive in their laws that they have on the books for serving children with dyslexia and qualifying them, where some aren't. Here in the state of Texas, at the age of kindergarten, they have to do a pre-dyslexia screening on phonological awareness. And if the child shows those early warning signs in phonological awareness, which is the auditory processing, then they have to begin to provide interventions within the classroom. One of those interventions could be working with a certified academic language therapist. So they are required to give 2 years, get 2 years of reading remediation. So yes, you have to get that testing done by the school district, see what the diagnosis comes, because diagnosis is what leads to intervention. Long ago, we used to fear the diagnosis. Now it becomes the main inroad to getting help.
What do you think about play therapy to help address some of these needs?
For a child with social and emotional weaknesses, yes. However, play therapy needs to be the forced application of a skill learned in one-on-one sessions. It's like I go to a skills coach to learn how to hit the ball better in tennis. I don't go play tennis matches, right?
Mm-hmm.
I learn the skill first. Then I play in a match. I see what doesn't work. I come back and I take those notes. My poor tennis coach gets notes from me every week. Okay, we need to work on lobs because somebody kept lobbing me. And then we go back and practice. It's got to be both a one-on-one and then practice it in play therapy.
Do you have any suggestions for evaluating nonverbal students?
Yes. An evaluation center would a true evaluation center that has as tools so many different screenings for children nonverbally. There are some intelligence tests that are actually tests of nonverbal intelligence. Because selective mutes, they're not going to respond either. They have to have enough receptive language in order to process the direction and be able to point.
Do you have any information about development of children who are exposed to multiple languages?
There is an area of the brain that is set and ready to acquire language. Some children who are not at risk for a learning difference acquire dual languages very, very well. Some children who are neurotypical will acquire the receptive language much better than they do the expressive language. But if you are a child at risk for a learning difference, acquiring your mother tongue of English or whatever you're going to be asked to do in school, if you are going to be sent to an English-speaking school, we ask our families who are dual language to first and foremost not introduce written language if right now oral language in English is too difficult, and second, do not require expressive language to develop in a second language. Babies learn, and so do everyone acquiring a second language. You learn receptively first. So the receptive channel may be okay, but that expressive channel, they will get very confused going back and forth between Chinese and English. Also know languages carry with them in expressive and receptive tonal quality to words. As a matter of fact, Mandarin is all tonal quality. It's the same enunciation with a different tone means a totally different word. So if you're already struggling with auditory processing and understanding that difference, at least noticeable difference in loud, soft, learning a second language is going to be very difficult for you.
Okay. Is auditory processing disorder correlated to dyslexia?
Yes, it's also correlative to attention. So central auditory processing disorder at its definition means your auditory system is receiving all sounds at the same intensity. So right now, everyone listen in your environment. Do you hear a clock ticking, the air conditioner, a fan, someone talking outside your room, my voice? When we were presenting, all of those sounds were there. But what did you mainly hear? Me. Central auditory processing disorder, they hear it all. They hear it all at the same intensity. Why it's correlative to dyslexia is how do you discriminate human speech sounds and learn when all of that is going on in the background. So an FM system would help with that. But here's why it's correlated to ADHD. Give a kid headphones, ask them to work on a puzzle or something in a group environment. So you've taken out the noise. The classroom, so in our classrooms here at our school are very quiet. We're all working in Montessori. Each child is doing their own thing, working for themselves, by themselves. If you take out the noise and you ask them to focus, can they focus, or are they still looking all around the room? Because when you take out the potential of an auditory distraction, you no longer can say, oh, it's primarily central auditory processing disorder. So young children are often diagnosed with that. It's diagnosed by an audiologist, and we see it later develop in the later years when auditory is taken out and they're having difficulty with sustaining attention, that it could have been masking really an attention issue and not so grounded in auditory processing disorder.
How early can kids be tested for dyslexia?
Diagnostic centers don't like to do it before third grade, but we're seeing more and more that diagnostic centers will be doing it at second grade, knowing that by third grade, nationally, a switch is made from K through second. We're teaching you to read. By third grade, you're reading to learn. So we're seeing more centers wanting to formally diagnose at second grade, but the warning signs are there. Go get an evaluation if you feel like in kindergarten or first grade that acquisition of reading isn't coming along, because a test that they can do is it's called the test of phonological processing, or the CTOP. It is going to test that phonological awareness because that's the first self sign of a child with a learning difference.